Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today is the 14th of May, and today we're documenting Russian advances, in particular around Chasiv because we have an advance that is out of the ordinary, given the fact that the front line has been rather static around the Citadel microdistrict in western Chasiv. The fighting over there has been dragged out for months upon months by now, and suddenly the Russians have been able to conduct an armored attack that has infiltrated rather deep past the Ukrainian lines. So we're going to look at the full extent of that documented advance. We'll look at more generally how the Russians are positioning themselves around Konstantinivka and how Chasiv Yar plays a role in all of that. But I will begin by zooming in on some of the new developments. I want to see if there's something from Velika Novosilka. There is just this small sliver of territory that the Russians were able to capture following their successive gains over the past couple of days west of Novosilka. So you can see it amounts to 1.2 square kilometers, meaning the Russians are now, if we're measuring it, are at least 1.9 kilometers away. And so this is getting very close to Zelenopole and Novopil, these two villages that I've reiterated before are fallback points for the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainians were trying to resist the Russian advances around Novosilka, but given the small surface area, it was simply untenable for a large force of Ukrainian soldiers. Like even a company-sized formation couldn't really stay around there to defend for any extended period of time. And there are no open fields that host trenches or tree lines that could actually accommodate that sort of Ukrainian force, because there are Ukrainian forces over here from the 122nd TDF Brigade, 110th TDF Brigade, 17th National Guard Brigade operating around here. And then further north, the 31st Mechanized Brigade, probably the highest caliber unit the Ukrainians have in this area, trying to continue with defensive activities and just dragging out fighting in Vilna Pole and Shevchenko. So that's just a word on the garrison over here. But the Russians have been able to capitalize on this void formed by the Ukrainian withdrawals and have just continued seizing open fields in areas that are simply uncontested. And this can continue going on. The Russians can continue seizing these territories for, say, another 6 square kilometers before eventually reaching these two villages. And by then, there will be no buffer for the Ukrainians that they would be able to afford east of those populated regions. And then they would be within the purview of ground incursions and ground attacks, as we're seeing right now with Vilna Pole and Shevchenko. So again, we're going to keep a keen eye on those developments. We'll start the videos out with those developments on a daily basis. I do want to look up Pokrovsk, just a small positional update from Lysivka. So the Ukrainians in recent weeks have been able to retake about 1 square kilometer of the town. And this is something that just continues happening. This is probably the seventh or eighth Ukrainian counterattack and eighth round of back and forths between either side in this village. The reason why this is really an area that's difficult to retain control over is because of the elevation nearby. The Ukrainians are simply more advantageous when it comes to their positions that are located a bit to the north of the line of contact. So Pokrovsk and its suburbs, including the immediate vicinity where you have these trench lines in yellow, they are located on extremely high elevation in comparison to some of the river valleys and gullies where the line of contact is situated, including areas that are currently under Russian control, spanning from Shevchenko, for instance, which is again very low elevation, all the way to an area like, say, Sukhi Yar, that entire region. So this area that you see over here with the red line, located on some of the lowest elevation in this region. And Lysivka falls in the center of that. So the Ukrainians, they have these forward firing points and very good vantage positions to overlook the fighting that is going on in Lysivka. And so they can just continue sending in reinforcements from those heights to fight downhill, whereas the Russians are working on an uphill battle. They first have to, go through the grueling process of clearing out a populated area where the Ukrainians are resisting in every single basement, but then they actually have to retain that amidst Ukrainian counterattacks coming up from better situated areas, topographically speaking, from the north. And then they can't really expand past the Sivka, honestly, because of the density of trenches and manpower nearby. Another issue is, of course, due to the drone crews from either side that are very active around Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk is really becoming a area defined by drone crews and the way in which they target logistics that are really far away from the line of contact. So let's begin with how the Russians are using it. So you do have a lot of skilled drone operators that were operating around Kursk and played a role in squeezing the noose, tightening it as the Ukrainians were on their last legs throughout that March, April period in 2025. So it's not that long ago. And they were involved in the process of targeting vehicles and infantry on roads in Sumy itself. So, 15, 20 kilometers away from the line of contact at some point, all the way up until Kursk itself, which is much closer. And they were doing so with a wide variety of drones, not just fiber optic drones, but those were some of the most readily available ones and the ones with a lot of results being produced. So now a lot of those drone operators, they are operating under the Rubicon drone units, which is currently fighting in the area west of Turetsk, but there are also drone operators deployed to the Pokrovsk area with, a similar resume. So they're involved targeting the E50 highway and making it untenable for Ukrainian vehicles to move over here. And that is important because, when you're looking at a day-to-day clash along the line of contact, you need reinforcements to come in. And the best way to do so isn't by foot, it's to do so through a civilian vehicle, a pickup truck, something like that. Something that's, not too high stakes, but is good in terms of mobility. And a lot of those just get picked off and they don't have good armor whenever they're spotted and targeted by an FPV drone. And now, just due to the fiber optic drones, the chances of jamming them have become much, much lower. And so we're seeing that implemented by the Russian side over here. Likewise, the Ukrainians are trying to do the same thing with the Russian logistics. The road networks in general around Pokrovsk are rather poor. They're not well maintained. And especially since the war started, they haven't been maintained at all. So the very few paved roads that are located in an area north of Novotroitska, by now they're just in a horrible state. And so heavy weaponry, heavy vehicles making it to this part of the front line isn't really that common. But whenever, movement does occur over here, it is threatened due to drone crews from the Ukrainian side. And you could see that's because this area only spans 9 kilometers. So from either side, you could have Ukrainian drone crews sending in, their assets to try to target the Russian rear, and the radius of that coverage basically extends to the entire salient. So that also has an effect on the Russians' logistics. So it goes both ways, but it's also an issue because now the Russian side is beginning to pummel and destroy a lot of the Ukrainian fortifications uh, before they even arrive at them in areas that are circling around the perimeter of Pokrovsk. So now there has to be a lot of attention given by the Ukrainian side to how they can shape their new defenses in lieu of future Russian attacks to sort of just stave off the sort of deficiencies logistics wise that are caused by the resurgence in Russian drone attacks. So looking at the front line east of Pokrovsk, you can see over here that the Russians were able to advance deeper into Malinivka. North of it, they captured 1.7 square kilometers of territory, and to the west, nearly 1 square kilometer. There's a geolocation here from May 11th of the 14th National Guard, one of the main units that is operating around here. Their brigade conducted FPV strikes on vehicles, motorcycles, and Russian soldiers situated in houses over here. So, just naturally, by extension, the Russians are getting close to Mirny, which is another village around here. It's very small in surface area, meaning it will be difficult for the Ukrainians to defend over here for any extended period of time. And then what's important to note is that there's only a distance of 2.5 kilometers before reaching a really important populated area, that being over here, Novoekonomichny. That's what it's called. But again, the Russian objectives, as I laid out in my video yesterday, are likely to advance uphill to take over some of the nearby slag heaps on rather high elevation and just adjacent ridges, all with the objective of arriving at an area that's directly north of Pokrovsk. An area like Rodinska, that's a good example of an area that would be within the Russian purview, but with the objective of cutting off the northern road that supplies the city of Pokrovsk, and it connects to Dobropilia to the north. So that's something that we can see and deduce based on the recent Russian maneuvers over here. Now to move on to the Konstantinivka direction, the Russians just continue with their momentum over here, which is expected, and it's only going to actually increase in pace, and I'll explain why in a moment. But we can see over here north of Novoelenivka, the Russians captured another zero point 0.7 square kilometers of territory. As I repeated in yesterday's video, the Russians in this region are seeping into the trenches and then using them to rapidly advance forward and clearing out whatever modicum of Ukrainian resistance remains. And there isn't much of it over here, for instance. The Ukrainians simply are unable to mount a defensive campaign using these defenses because look at the way they were built. They were built with anticipation that there would be forward attacks coming in from the directions that you see with these arrows over here. That's how they're clearly structured. These anti-tank ditches, these dragon's teeth, sometimes even barbed wire in trenches. So it really, despite all of that, the Russians are just attacking from the southern tip and then just advancing through the trenches and clearing them out systematically. And it's being done with drone support. It's being done by infantry that have a lot of momentum. We looked at some of the unit deployments recently. A lot of it is coming from the 33rd Motor Rifle Regiment. It's one of the most notable units mentioned, but they're working in tandem with Regiment 255, both on Alexanderpil and on Novoelenivka. And now they are already at the gates of Western Yablunivka, which acts as a sort of coordination point for the Ukrainians along this part of the front line. And it's important because taking it over just by close proximity would also give the Russians access to this entire trench network, an area that, if it were to have been attacked head on, if the circumstances would have aligned in such a way that the Russians really had no other choice but to attack head on, then the casualties would have been much higher. The pace would be much slower. And now, due to this momentum, the Russians also have the opportunity to reach this road network that directly leads into Konstantinivka from the southwestern direction. So this is really important, and you can see how all the pieces are falling together in terms of Russian maneuvers over here to eventually culminate around the city of Konstantinivka. And you can see that just due to these deep Russian penetrations, by just clear nature, it creates these excess salients the Ukrainians are stubborn about withdrawing from. They don't want to because then the Russians would have a lot of momentum and they would be able to take over a lot of these large swaths of territory, these buffer areas, and completely focus their efforts on areas further northwards. So that's their logic. They want to tie down Russian forces in these salients and thereby stretch out the front line. And they don't want to use a huge manpower commitment for it. They just want to use a couple of squads, a couple of dozen soldiers in each point, but it's enough to then divert a much larger amount of Russian forces to ensure that they can eventually squeeze them all out. That's what we're seeing around here. But it's reaching the point where they will have no ability to withdraw unless they do so on their own accord. And if they don't, then they could actually get physically cut off at this point. I say this because a recent advance that was recorded by the Russian side indicates they've reached the only paved road in this region that is basically located in between Alexanderpil and Hnativka. And so now the Russians will have access to this road to, horizontally advance and then cut off whatever small squads are still operating in the hinterlands. And so the Ukrainians right now are likely in the process of withdrawing because there is no feasible way for them to ensure continuity over such a stretched out salient that also lacks any really well defended points. It would be one thing if they were defended a populated area with basements or trench network that was well connected and included a lot of obstacles. But there really only is one trench network immediately north of Kalinova, and then everything in between is largely open and sparsely defended. And same story over here with this very narrow corridor, making it even more vulnerable to getting cut off. You can look at the distance; it's only about 3 kilometers in width. So this is another area that naturally will be cut off, or the Ukrainians will naturally withdraw from it. You could also see something similar in between Romanivka and Novospassky. So a lot of these cauldrons, a lot of these salients have been forming recently. And just as a reminder, the Russians advanced nearly 6 square kilometers, and this geolocation is from May 14th. It shows FPV strikes and grenade drops onto individual Russian soldiers as they were advancing through open fields and tree lines with the hopes of reaching Zoria. And they've done so at a rapid pace. What this means is that one of the only remaining populated regions along this, say, 15-kilometer span of the front line is now contested. It's no longer under full Ukrainian control. And Zoria is important because then it connects to Romanivka, and then you'll have the new line of Russian forward villages. And that's where their troops will be stationed. And from there, they continue expanding northwards to areas like Alexandra Kalinova and Yablunivka, and they will eventually become the forward operating bases towards Konstantinivka and towards flanking the really dense and really well and tight knit Ukrainian garrison that is operating around Novospassky and Sochi because right now frontal assaults are simply not feasible to overrun the Ukrainian garrison over here, but it is in an exposed position and it could be even more exposed by its western flank being compromised if the Russians continue advancing northwards along the highway and then turn some of their attention westwards, or rather eastwards in this case. So again, that's another thing to keep an eye out for in the coming months. But let's zoom in and see the development from Chasiv because that's really interesting to see. Because the Ukrainians have mounted I would refer to it as successful defensive campaign in Chasiv. If you guys recall, we talked about this last year, but the battle for the city started with the micro district east of the Donbass Canal, and it's really not that far away. If we're measuring it, the battles started about 6 kilometers away, and that was over a year ago. It was actually 13 months ago because it started the beginning of April of 2024. And even with that micro district, which is extremely small in surface area, due to the high concentration of apartment buildings and defenses basically between every house, it took a very long time to overrun it. So that in its own right was a difficulty. Then crossing over the canal and over the trenches built on either side of the canal, which by the way is located on some of the highest elevation in this entire area, that was also a challenge. Then getting seeped in, having the 98th VDV division have their forces seep in either on foot or through armored assaults into the first houses west of the Donbass Canal was also a difficulty. Getting them seeped into forested areas south of Chasiv or in these areas that include the local highway and all these quarries and industrial facilities, that was also a challenge because there was back and forth. And then the process of entering into the Citadel of Chasiv and clearing out the houses north of it in these northern districts, those were all challenges in their own right. And the Ukrainian garrison over here, it's not extremely large, but the forces that are involved have displayed a level of defensive acumen and grit, gumption, you could say, that has allowed them to continue with their defense over here for over a year. Of course, a large part of that, as I laid out, is the fact that it is extremely complicated from a geographic standpoint to overrun some of these areas, not just in terms of the fortifications, but also where they're placed. The fact they're placed on key heights in between forested areas, in between dense, urban pockets, in between, high ridges, water boundaries due to the canal. Like there's so many reasons why it would be difficult to overrun some of these locations. But regardless of all of that fact, being able to retain control over the city, even parts of it, for 13 months is still a really incredible feat. And one of the main units involved that deserves credit is the 24th Mechanized Brigade. They were moved in when the Russians started to gain some momentum in the summer of 2024. And ever since then, they've been involved and have been at the cutting edge of a lot of the defensive activities. And they're also accompanied by a couple of other units like 5th Assault Brigade, 112th TDF Brigade, IDAR units. You have to the north the 18th National Guard Brigade and the 56th Motorized Brigade. So that's just a rundown of the deployment. But let's look at the actual Russian advance, because regardless of how you spin it, the advance was deep, and we're going to look at the two possibilities of where it could have come from. But regardless, here's the end point. This is from May 14th. 24th Brigade destroyed 3 Russian BMD-3s. These were from the 98th VDV Brigade, and they claim to have killed 20 Russian soldiers in the attack, which I can't verify. I don't even see 20 soldiers in the video itself that were spotted by the Ukrainian drone. But the geolocation does show us that at most the Russians were able to advance southwards 800 meters, which is a lot through this really dense area, because the Ukrainians have been able to isolate the fighting in Chasiv to this one small pocket. And, it's an area that they are well prepared for, because every single house is a fortress in its own right. Overrunning it is difficult. They span from like 4 to 7 stories high, some of these buildings. And, their actual concrete slabs are very hard to destroy, even using artillery shelling or UMPKs. That's simply not sufficient, and we know that because the Russians have been doing that for a year, and it's not been enough to cause significant damage to the skeletal structure of a lot of these buildings. So you can see over here that a lot of the fighting started around the beginning of this year, and it's just drawn out. As a result of this recent Russian advance, though, they were able to capture 32 hectares, and the geolocation from here is from May 14th, so it is very recent. It appears based on the route of the vehicles that they're advancing through a forested area. So I'm inclined to believe they advanced from the northern district and then were able to find a local route to push southwards all the way to the locations that were filmed by the 24th Brigade's drone crews. So that's a possibility. Or the other one would be that they directly crossed over from the refractory and then pushed southwards all the way to Volitsia Dniprovska, this road along the western edge of the city of Chasiv Yar. Now, there's a question about whether the Ukrainians still remain in this micro district. It's certainly possible because we haven't received confirmation of Russian presence in this area that I'm going to mark in red. There's no geolocated proof or mentioned by Ukrainian sources or even Russian ones at this point. There are murmurs about a full Ukrainian retreat from this area, but I'm obviously going to exercise caution. And other reports say that the Ukrainians have simply coalesced their positions around the houses that they still retain control over in this area and also some of the apartment buildings. There are a lot of convenience stores in the area captured by Russia, whereas on the Ukrainian side, you have the town hall, you have a community center, you have this local school. You can see it over here. So, or the school's over here actually, but you get the point. There is this very small, almost square-shaped area that remains under Ukrainian control, 20 hectares in size, but every single structure within it is difficult to overrun and would lead to excessive casualties. And so the Russian forces will look for ways to squeeze out those remaining Ukrainian forces, all with the objective of fully taking over the Citadel, because that would mark the end of the Battle of Chasiv Yar pretty much. And then we would shift towards the phase of overrunning the western outskirts of Chasiv Yar. Because even once the district over here falls, and that definitely could happen depending on the Ukrainian movements. If they decide to reinforce this area and are able to conduct some sort of immediate stabilization, obviously there could be a change. But looking at the future, we know that nearby there are a lot of territories that will be difficult to overrun from a Russian perspective. You have Shevchenko over here, the suburb of Chasiv Yar. It's pretty large in surface area, a lot of houses. Each one is fortified. There's been so much time to prepare them. A lot of Ukrainian units are deployed to this area in these basements, prepared to defend in those locations. And there are a lot of other examples, like this village over here, Yuzhny, sort of an extension of Shevchenko, and then over here, Mykolaievka, Chervone, Podilske. So a lot of these sort of rural, stretched out villages, poor road network, sandwiched in between forests, rugged terrain, all the factors that make it difficult for deep advances by the attacking side in this case. But once you overrun that sort of uncomfortable area, the very difficult area when it comes to the geography, you reach a Ukrainian defensive line, which was probably built over there to ensure that the Russians couldn't exploit the full capture of Chasiv Yar's western suburbs. So the actual buffer zone between the trenches in the line of contact is currently the suburb region that I just talked about, which spans at most 4 kilometers. But then you arrive at the actual defensive line, which runs from basically the southern perimeter of Konstantinivka and even the areas we talked about before, all the way up northwards to areas like Markove and basically locations west of the Donbass Canal. It extends for a very long period of time further northwards. So, looking at Konstantinivka, there is a outer perimeter that is being worked on as a defensive boundary. There's also a inner perimeter, an immediate location, immediate defensive position that is just outside of the city, but it is much smaller in size and scale. There are openings though. You can see this opening over here that spans about 1.7 kilometers. So that's an area that's very close to a highway, so it could be exposed to attacks. There's obviously the northeastern slash northern entrance into Konstantinivka, which also spans about 4.2 kilometers. You also have this western entrance, and there's always the possibility of Russian soldiers continuing with their momentum and attacking the defenses head on, even from areas that would appear to be difficult and costly to overrun. So all of that must be taken into account. And also the fact that the attacks from Chasiv Yar are not occurring in isolation. They're occurring in tandem with the Russian activity in Turetsk and with the activity towards Yablunivka. In Turetsk, the objective is obviously now to displace the really, significant Ukrainian garrison that is situated around the perimeter of the city. Because as long as they're still, operating very close to Turetsk, they're going to continue with these raids, and it's going to be difficult to create distance and approach Konstantinivka. But from a Ukrainian perspective, for them, it's difficult to hold out where they currently are because they don't have enough lodging locations near the front line for such a large group of forces. We're looking at areas that are largely open in nature. You could see where the Ukrainians are deployed. You can see all these open fields. You can see there are a couple of smaller hamlets and towns and villages around here. And then you have just a very narrow routes where troops can be situated, but it's also an area that's, enduring a lot of concentrated Russian fire. So, all in all, Turetsk is an objective that's very important because the goal is then to advance along the Turetsk River and attack through this opening over here and reach the southern outskirts of Konstantinivka directly. Then we talked about it already, but there's also the advance towards Yablunivka with the objective of reaching the southwestern entrance to the city. And then from the east, there's the possibility of advancing past Chasiv Yar and arriving at the eastern outskirts. There are a lot of heights located on Chasiv Yar that are currently falling into Russian hands, and they also extend into open fields currently under Ukrainian control, but that could easily be seized because there are not many villages in those locations. So those are potential areas that could actually be used to overlook locations such as Konstantinivka in the future. So that's really why it's important for the Russians to get control over not just Chasiv Yar, but also some of the open fields just at northwest, because that would give the Russians the ultimate elevation advantage in this location. And based on what we're seeing, Konstantinivka could actually suffer a similar fate to Pokrovsk. And it's ironic because they're both located on the same road network. So they're pretty much connected via that road network. But obviously now it's not being used because the Russians cut it off. But the point is that there could be this sort of semicircle shape, this, I suppose, like a meniscus shape, this cauldron shape, whatever you want to call it, that the Russians have been so fond of. And it's really manifested itself recently with Pokrovsk. And it could play a role in cutting off the logistics to Konstantinivka, which again, right now they may appear to be stable, but once the Russians advance through those three directions that we talked about, the only reliable route they'll have is from this northwestern road. And that's when the drone crews come in. That's when the firepower from artillery and airstrikes come in. That's when physical ground pressure and DRG raids begin to play a role. And that's when the Ukrainians really have their positions undermined. And that road between Kramatorsk and Konstantinivka begins to come under significant strain. So that's something that has to be looked at. And there's also obviously the open area west of Konstantinivka directly that could be used as a supply point. But you can see there's only one local road that extends out of it and then pushes, westwards all the way to like Toretske and this entire line of villages that is then connected to Druskivka. So that's just a rundown of Konstantinivka because I believe it will become a focal point for a lot of Russian activity. The Ukrainian side, their intelligence is reporting that there's going to be an uptick in Russian attacks, and it really doesn't take any intelligence to see that. It takes, looking at trends and looking at the activity for the past couple of days and understanding the nature of the negotiations in Turkey, for instance, to get an idea of the fact that the Russians will be ramping up their offensive activity. I'm not talking about an offensive. I'm talking about multiple attacks occurring simultaneously across a large stretch of the front line and new attacks potentially popping up depending on the versatility of certain locations and whether, there's a gap in the Ukrainian line that's spotted. So it's all a part of that sort of broader narrative. And we're going to obviously keep a keen eye out for the political perspective with the drama that's currently unfolding in Turkey. Trump's on his Middle Eastern visit, and he's supposed to visit Turkey, I think, after he visits the UAE, if I'm not mistaken, because he was in Qatar today before he was in Saudi Arabia. So he will be in Turkey, and that's going to be around the time that Zelensky is visiting as well, which I believe is actually tomorrow or Thursday. He'll be visiting and meeting with Erdogan, and he was saying that he expects Putin to be there. Putin, based on the reporting that we have, will not be attending, and neither will Lavrov. The Russians are proposing a delegation, a Russian negotiating delegation. They say should be sent to Turkey to negotiate with the Ukrainian team, but not necessarily the leadership itself, like Zelensky or Putin. So that's the current disagreement. And it appears that from recent statements that were only released a couple of hours ago, that Zelensky may be sort of moderating his stance on this fact and may be willing to begin the talks with Russia, not necessarily through direct contact between leadership between Zelensky and Putin, but first using these negotiating teams as a proxy, because he does want to symbolize his willingness to get into these talks. That's the way he's been framing the entire ordeal with Russia, and the way that he's been, framing the negotiations is that there should first be a 30-day ceasefire, and then after that, technical teams can begin to discuss the details of territorial control, security guarantees, and such. Whereas the Russians would just prefer to get into negotiations about those facts of the matter from the get go. So that's also another source of friction. And Zelensky is hoping that that friction could also paint Russia in a negative light and then give momentum for new sanctions on Russia, and also obviously galvanized aid. There is an issue with aid though, because Macron, he's recently talked about how France is exhausted its ability to provide aid to Ukraine, and there's a debate about whether Russian assets can be legally seized, and Macron's actually a bit iffy on it. And so that's an entirely different discussion. At the same time, the new chancellor in Germany, Friedrich Merz, he's really looking keenly at increasing aid to Ukraine, bolstering up his own military, increasing sanctions on Russia. The EU announced the 17th package of sanctions on Russia, and they're really looking to close down on any loopholes. But ultimately, what's actually going to make a difference to a certain degree, if we're obviously looking at the blowback that could occur, it would be what the United States is willing to do in order to achieve, the beginning of talks, direct talks between Russia and Ukraine. Because if the U.S. were to implement stronger sanctions, the Treasury Department were to, close loopholes and even perhaps enact secondary sanctions, which again, that's a really difficult conversation in its own rights, then that would be a completely different deal, and that would be playing into the hands of what Zelensky would hope would occur if Russia was not responsive to the rounds of negotiations over the coming days in Turkey. And so that's all for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.